Hello, everybody. Welcome to this model lesson. We're going to go through a Greek lesson today. My name is Mitchell. I'm the Greek expert here at Highlands Latin School. I work for Memoria Press, working on some of our curriculum. Today, I'm going to show you how I would teach a lesson from First Form Greek. We're going to go over some broad information here at the beginning, just to help you as a teacher. But then, as you can see on the board, I've written down a lesson, kind of generally how I would teach it. So hopefully this will be of help to you as we go through it. If you have any questions, this is really important. Feel free to go down to the comment section. We'll answer those either during the live stream, or if you have questions afterwards, feel free to post and we'll answer them forthwith. So first, let me cover some things that we're going to get into the model lesson, but for you as a teacher, what are some ways that you should prep and prepare for teaching a lesson? The first thing I would do in preparing for a lesson like this, I'm going to go through lesson 11. So the first thing I was going to do if I was preparing to teach lesson 12 of First Form Greek is I would read the text. I would take the student text and I would read it very carefully. This is before I even get to my student. So maybe ideally I'd like to stay a week ahead of my student so that I'm able to kind of master the material somewhat as best as I can in that week before my student gets to it. So the week before my student gets to this, I'm going to read through the text. I'm going to try to understand. I'm going to try to commit some forms to memory. And that's going to be a really important first step for you. Read the text first. The second thing I would do is actually go to your teacher manual. Inside your teacher manual, as you open up to lesson 12, then you'll see the whole week kind of at a glance. You'll see what you do on day 1 on Monday. You'll see what you do on day 2 and day 3 and day 4. But then there's also going to be some extra notes on there. There's going to be some notes that kind of look forward to tell you, this piece of information is important because later on they'll learn this. Or you'll see some pieces of information that kind of point backwards. You recall what you learned back here. It's going to help you make additional connections for you as a teacher. Not things that you necessarily need to teach to the student, but things that will help you kind of wrap your mind around these concepts so that you can teach them effectively to your student. So that's the second thing I would look at. The third thing I would look at is the quizzes and the test. Now, the quizzes and the test, the reason why this is important is not because we're trying to teach to the test necessarily, but in one way we are, because what we believe that the quizzes and tests accurately represent exactly what we want the student to get out of the lesson. So I'm going to turn to, so with that said, if you're not teaching the things that are in the test, then you're probably not teaching everything they need to learn from this lesson. And they're not going to be able to go on unless you make sure that you've taught everything that's in this test. So this is almost like a good benchmark. Are you teaching effectively enough so that when your student comes to take this test, they're going to be successful? So as I look at the test, I see that there's a vocabulary section. I see that they're going to have to recognize what form the verb is in. And I see some conjugations where they're going to have to create a paradigm in things. I see some grammar questions, a little bit of translation and things like that. Okay, so I'm locking that away. So that's the third thing I would look at. The fourth thing I would do is there's DVDs and pronunciation CDs that go along with First Form Greek. I would definitely encourage you to watch those before Monday occurs so that you can begin to see how a professional teacher has digested some of this material and then begun to teach that to her children. That can just be helpful if you yourself are new to Greek, if this is totally outside your comfort zone, even if you haven't had Latin before. That can be just a helpful way of you could watch how someone else has done it, and then you can even begin to imitate some of the things that they've done. So that's how I would think about prep. And again, that's in a perfect world, right? So we don't always have 30, 45 minutes a week before our children get there to really start digesting this information. So here's what I would suggest. Read the text, read the teacher manual, and at least try to look at the DVD if you can. The DVD will be just a helpful way of seeing how a professional teacher has worked through that information. So that would be kind of a short period of time. All right, well, that's how I would think about prepping. Now let's think about the lesson itself. I think a lesson should probably be structured the same way every time. And what I mean by that is, every time I teach a new lesson, I try to focus on the form and then the function. So you're always moving from, you give them a new form, you teach them how to form it, and then you tell them what that form means. And you can kind of see that in the order of my board here. First, I'm reviewing everything they already know, all the other forms. Second, I'm going to introduce the new forms. And then third, I'm going to tell them about the meaning. But what's important to remember is that if you keep this kind of form and meaning approach, you're getting rid of distraction for the student. So the student can focus on the essential pieces of information, which is what does the new thing look like and what can I do with it, okay? Now on Monday, there's just a lot to do. So I would look at your teacher manual, and your teacher manual is going to give you a good idea of what you need to do on Monday. Monday is your biggest day. Every other day is just reviewing. Every other day for the week is just reviewing what you did on Monday and preparing for the quiz. So when Monday gets here, it's going to tell me that I should first start off by reciting and reviewing. It's going to give me some things here to recite, some things to review with my student. For lesson 11, which is primarily this information, lesson 12, it's going to be most important that we review lesson 11, the lesson that we covered last week. And here's how I would begin to do that. First, after you do your recitation, so look closely at the teacher manual. After you do your recitation, I would then review the new vocabulary for this particular lesson. So for this particular lesson, our new vocabulary starts with the second word. There's more, but this just gives you an idea. So, and this is how I'd review with the student. I would first say to demonstrate pronunciation, ask them to repeat after me, and then we'll say the meaning together. So I will say, blepo, blepo. I throw, I throw. Gnosko, gnosko. I know, I know. Grapho, grapho. And then we would do that for all of our vocab for this particular week. It's important to demonstrate proper pronunciation, or at least to try your best, because pronunciation is a large part of helping you memorize words and their meaning, especially for just visual, auditory. It's just helpful to get as much of that accurate as possible. So after I started by reviewing the vocabulary, I would then go towards reviewing the forms that they learned last week, which is the present active. And I would start by saying, we would recite all of the review paradigms together. We would say, luo, lues, lue, luamen, lete, lucy. And then if we had time, I would try to slowly erase some of that, and I would say, luo, lues, lue, luamen, lete, lucy. And then I would maybe do the whole thing, and then we'd say it all together, luo, lues, lue, luamen, lete, lucy. And then we would remember the endings of the present active. Okay, so that you saw the endings that were up here. We'd review them together. Always a amaneta usi. Always a amaneta usi. We'd say that a couple times. I would begin to erase some. We'd say them again, and then we'd kind of get through that. After that, I would turn our attention to the imperfect tense. Now, in the imperfect tense, it can be a little bit difficult for students because it's their first introduction to this thing called the augment. So let me turn your attention to this example up here. So up here, there's 3 pieces of information that the student needs to know about the imperfect tense. They need to know that there's the stem is the first principal part. Then they need to know that in the imperfect, part of the anatomy of the imperfect tense is that there's an augment. This is going to be very unfamiliar for students coming from Latin, because in Latin, when you're forming any tense, you have a stem, and then you put on endings on the end of your stem, but you never put something at the beginning of your stem. Well, in Greek, you do. It's this thing called an augment. An augment is, in this case, what we're learning right now, is just an epsilon. So you just take an epsilon and you put it on the beginning of your stem, and then you add your imperfect endings. And so that's the 3 pieces of the imperfect tense. If you're just joining us, my name is Mitchell. I'm the Greek specialist here at Memoria Press. We're doing a model Greek lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below. I've just introduced the anatomy of the imperfect, and now we're going to look at its paradigm. We're going to look at its chart, which is right here. In this chart, There's things that you can do to kind of help the students make connections between what they learned in lesson 11, the perfect tense, and what they're learning now, right? So, I would help them see that this ending and this ending is the same as what they had last week. I would help them see that there's the stem is the same as the first principal part, as the present tense. And then I would help them identify what's new. Well, there's this thing at the beginning called a augment that's new, completely new. And then there's a few new endings. After I've helped them make that connection, I would then pronounce each one of these forms for them, and then we would say it together multiple times. We would do the disappearing line trick. We would say it in funny voices or whatever you need to do to make sure that your student kind of has this on lock. This is the model verb for all of Greek. So every time you learn a new paradigm, you're going to be using this. So you've got to be able to have this particular verb. It's got to be like your light in a dark path. I mean, this is the thing that you just got to have close to you, because it'll be the thing that guides you as you're looking at other verbs. So I'd really make sure that they have this, okay? So for now, we'll just ignore the first part, but really focus on the endings. And I would practice, we would say it together. Eloan, Eloe, Siloe, Eloamen, Eloete, Eloan. Eloan, Eloe, Siloe, Eloamen, Eloete, Eloan. After we've said that a few times, I would begin to erase some pieces. We'd say it together, and then we'd move down to the endings. The endings were already up here. They already had it in the chart, but it's really important that they know both the endings and what the endings look like on the verb luo. The reason why that's important is because there's more than one verb in the Greek language. So just because they can recognize the endings on luo doesn't mean that they can take those endings and apply them to any Greek verb. So we want to drill both luo, which is our model verb, and the ending. So on ace a, amen etion, on ace a, amen etion. We would do that. I would erase a little bit. You get the idea. So we've reviewed. We've explained what the imperfect is, how it's new. We've looked at the paradigms, the model verb, and the endings. Now we're going to think about how to create it from other verb examples. So I hope you can see a little bit of where I'm moving. First, I went from review to new information. Now I'm going to take that new information, I'm going to modify it using our new vocabulary. And here's how we're going to do that. We take the first principal part, or the present active. In other words, this chart up here. We take the first principal part of each one of these verbs, and I've written it in this first column. Now, we're trying to show the students that the imperfect tense, this new tense that they're learning, uses the same stem as the first principal part. So here's how I would do that. You can see I've used multiple colors here. There's other ways you could probably get at it. You could write just the stem and then add endings, things like that. But I've tried to demonstrate that with colors here, so I don't have to write on the board right now. But here you can see that all we've done with the first principal part is we've erased the ending of each principal part, and we've added the imperfect tense endings to the end. And then we've added the augment. So then you have your three parts. You've erased the ending on the first principal part so that you have just the stem, and you've added your ending, and you've added the augment. And then there you have, here it is, imperfect tense. So students have reviewed, students have learned a new form, they've learned how to modify that form with other verbs, they've seen it, how it looks with other verbs. Now they're ready, now they have this idea of how it's formed, now they're ready to think about the meaning of the imperfect tense. And here's where things can get a little confusing, but it doesn't have to be. Matter of fact, I would encourage you to keep it really simple, especially with Greek verb tenses. They divide up time a little bit differently than English does, but it's really important to not make it overly complicated. So I'll give you how I explain the imperfect tense. A lot of this information is in the student book as well. but this is kind of how I would lay out the information. Well, let me just pause and say this, that learning Greek and learning Latin is an excellent opportunity to refine your own understanding of English. Matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why we teach Latin and Greek, because it's such a time-tested tool for teaching English grammar. So if you can, I would try to illustrate using English so that they can get a clearer idea both of Greek and of English. In English, you have a past tense, a present tense, and a future tense. When you think about the past tense, things that are happening in the past, you have actions that happened in the past, like I walked. And then you have these other actions that happened in the past, but they're somehow ongoing, like I was walking. You can see the difference between here is not a matter of tense. Both of these are in the past tense, I walked or I was walking. But there seems to be this, it happened for this second part here, there seems to be this, it happened and it's still going. This is exactly what's happening in the imperfect tense. So let me go down here to the meaning of this particular verb form. While the first principal part, luo, means I loosen, the imperfect tense will mean I was loosening. Then eblepon from blepo would mean I was throwing. And egraphon from grapho will mean I was writing. You get this idea that one thing that can be helpful for the students is this is something that's happening in the past tense, but that past tense action is ongoing in some way. Well, this is kind of how I would cover lesson 12. Let me just tell you something real quick about principal parts. So in lesson 11, they learn the first principal part. They learn the present active, which is the first principal part. The principal parts for Greek verbs are often very unpredictable. It's definitely worth it to make sure at this early stage where your student is they've only have maybe 7 or 8 verbs by this time. It would be really important to make sure that even at this early stage that they can clearly spell each principal part as they're added, because they can actually get quite complicated. Another thing to remember about this lesson is that while the present active is the first principal part, the imperfect tense is not a new principal part. We saw here, whenever we erased the ending and added the augment, that it actually forms from the first principal part. That would be helpful to explain to your students. Other tenses are going to use other principal parts, but the present tense and the imperfect tense both use the first principal part. Well, this is kind of how I would lay it out. There's plenty of information there, but if you have any questions, we're here to help. So feel free to put a comment down at the bottom. We'd love to walk through some of your questions or concern. But in the meantime, go forth and may this embolden you to teach your students Greek.